former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
As Joe Biden inches closer to being named the winner of the presidential election, President Trump keeps the fires burning in court, intent on pursuing every lead in his attempt to overturn the result reported to the American people. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Biden builds a cabinet as Trump tries desperately to challenge results in one state after another. We'll paint the picture of both the diverse men and women named to cabinet posts by Biden and the legal case built by the president's lawyers. And we'll also consider a question: is Trump's work already done? Has he completed the most important work he came to do? Plus, we'll break down and analyze the much ballyhooed efforts of the president to win over minority voters and whether it has any staying power for Republicans going forward. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza jumps on board for Talkin' Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What?, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. As official Washington and the media proclaim Joe Biden as president-elect, the former vice president inches closer to actually, fully, and finally being declared the winner of the presidential election, as President Trump's lawyers continue their pursuit of the Holy Grail, the smoking gun, the game changer on multiple fronts, with lawsuits coming and going in a bunch of battleground states and more behind them. This as the day of reckoning, the Electoral College meeting of December 14th, grows ever closer. We'll start with some of the most notable claims of Trump's lawyers. First, Rudy Giuliani on a sworn affidavit from an election worker in Detroit.
She was assigned to voting duties in September, and she was trained by the city of Detroit and the state of Michigan. She was basically trained to cheat. She said that I was instructed by my supervisor to adjust the mailing date of these absentee ballot packages to be dated earlier than when they were actually sent in. The supervisor made that announcement for all workers to engage in that fraudulent practice.
So Giuliani is on one track, more what you might call the retail track, accumulating affidavits on instances of fraud, while Sidney Powell, not officially a member of the Trump legal team, pursues a different wholesale path based on serious questions about Dominion voting systems.
One of its most characteristic features is its ability to flip votes. It can set and run an algorithm that probably ran all over the country to take a certain percentage of votes from President Trump and flip them to Biden, which we might never have uncovered had the votes for President Trump not been so overwhelming in so many of these states that it broke the algorithm that had been plugged into the system. And that's what caused them to have to shut down.
As we've said here before, it's one thing to win in the court of public opinion, quite another to prove allegations like that with hard evidence in a court of law. But the left's view of the charges made by the Trump campaign is obviously quite different. The head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Sherilyn Ifill, says it's all typical Trump racism.
What the president has done and has done systematically and deliberately is to advance a norm in which the votes that are cast in majority black cities or predominantly black cities are seen and tainted in some way as being fraudulent or there being something wrong with them. We saw this outside when the canvassers were counting the votes, the day after election in Detroit. And we saw, all of these people standing outside saying, stop the count. And the president had people going back and forth about stop the count, count all the votes. But the places he was targeting, the racist dog whistle was Philadelphia, Atlanta, Detroit, Milwaukee.
Which are the biggest cities in each of the battleground states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia. Trump has been as quiet as we've ever seen him since the election as his legal team fights on, but he made an extraordinarily brief appearance at the White House this week to tout the stock market and COVID vaccines.
The stock market, Dow Jones Industrial Average, just hit 30,000, which is the highest in history. We've never broken 30,000, and that's just despite everything that's taken place with the pandemic. I'm very thrilled with what's happened on the vaccine front. That's been absolutely incredible. It's nothing like that has ever happened medically, and I think people are acknowledging that, and it's having a big effect. But the stock market's just broken 30,000. Never been broken, that number. That's a sacred number, 30,000. It's the 48th time that we've broken records during the Trump administration.
Those pointed comments about the stock market have led some to believe he was setting the stage for another run in 2024. Would he do it? His daughter-in-law and campaign bigwig Laura Trump says, sure.
If for some reason the president does not, win all these legal battles, then I think he said that he would be interested in looking to 2024. And I think that there are about 74 million Americans that would support him in a run for office. You've seen the way that he has really been masterful with, if nothing else, the economy. Dow hitting 30,000. When Donald Trump came into office, or when he was elected, it was around 17. And you see that the 30,000 is in the midst of a pandemic. Right. We know what he's able to do with the economy. We know what he's done on so many other fronts. And I think there are a lot of people that want to see 4 more years of this president.
So as Trump hangs on and contemplates his next moves, Joe Biden plows ahead with naming a prospective cabinet, going full-on diversity as promised and transmitting the unmistakable message that the days of America First will soon end, to be replaced by the familiar globalism which defined U.S. foreign policy up to the Trump era. One of the most prime examples came from Biden's choice for UN ambassador, Linda Thomas Greenfield.
My fellow career diplomats and public servants around the world, I want to say to you, America is back. Multilateralism is back. Diplomacy is back. The challenges we face, a global pandemic, the global economy, the global climate change crisis, mass migration and extreme poverty, social justice, are unrelenting and interconnected.
Yes, sir, folks, globalism is back, and better or worse than ever. And if you had any remaining shreds of doubt about the agenda of the elite media in Election 20, yes, agenda, not journalism, listen to PBS White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor, longtime antagonist of President Trump, go on MSNBC and describe the reported victory of Joe Biden.
This also felt like the Avengers. It felt like we're being rescued from this craziness that we've all lived through from the last 4 years. And now here are the superheroes to come and save us all.
Coming to save us all from the plague of Donald Trump. Joe Biden, superhero in the eyes of the adoring elite media. Quick break, and then we're back to analyze whether the best performance by a GOP presidential candidate among minorities in 60 years means a lot, a little, or something in between.
Ready, set, go.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com, because we put the power of the press in your hands. With one click, Liberty Nation delivers tomorrow's news.
And remember, liberty.
Today.
All the time and everywhere.
Liberty Nation connected the dots between a Chinese research biolab and a wet market where COVID-19 was supposedly discovered 2 months before the MSM. We were first to alert you of a serious attack on gun rights in Virginia. LN honed in on the Biden-Burisma scandal months before it hit the papers. We brought you exclusive interviews from the border.
We're looking at people just rising up.
Liberty Nation was on the ground in London,
Trump rally in front of the American embassy,
bringing you on-the-scene reports about Brexit. LN reported that COVID-19 was more virulent but less deadly weeks before others. LibertyNation.com delivers tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Liberty Nation Radio, the Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles and a new Roku channel. Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, much was made in the 2020 election campaign of President Trump's effort to attract a greater share of the minority vote. He's compiled an admirable record on issues ranging from criminal justice reform to opportunity zones in black communities to permanent funding of historically black colleges. But most of all, black and Hispanic unemployment fell to its lowest level ever. And this was supposed to boost the president's support substantially among minorities. And at least on the surface, it seemed to work because Trump got the greatest share of the minority vote, that's black and brown people, of any GOP presidential candidate in 60 years. But did it hit the target? Did it alter the minority vote enough to give Republicans hope on this front going forward? Joining us to help answer that question is LibertyNation.com socio-political correspondent, our old friend, Jeff Charles. Welcome back, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Jeff, we talked about this on more than one occasion leading up to the election and discussed how, if ever the GOP could make a breakthrough among minority communities, it would be this year, since Trump spent more political capital on attracting black and brown voters than any Republican we've ever seen. Would you call the reported result, tainted as it may be, more a breakthrough or more a disappointment?
Yeah, I think it's a breakthrough. And you and I, like you said, we've talked about this, and he performed basically the way I expected. I knew he was going to increase his support among Black Americans and amongst Latinos. And the reason why is because he actually put forth the effort. I mean, and there were a lot of times where Trump didn't do himself a lot of favors on race, but despite that, he actually reached out. He had a full team set up to reach out to minority voters to earn their trust. And even with the influence of the media and the Democratic Party, he was able to increase his percentage, which, by the way, the left, if you've noticed, is very upset about that. So this is a breakthrough, and I think that this does two things. It gives the Republican Party a template to follow that they can build upon as far as winning at the local and at the state and in Congress. I think it gives them that. And it also takes away the excuses, because the excuses is always, we can't win more voters in these areas because black people will never vote for us. Well, that's not true. I mean, Trump did better than Bush, McCain, and Romney. So if he can do that, then the GOP can do it as well.
So, Jeff, just how much do you believe the media assault on Trump as a racist penetrated the consciousness of black people across the country?
Oh, it was very effective. I mean, it's nothing different from what they do to every Republican president, right? They always paint them as racist, or even a Republican candidate. So that did its job as normal. Like I said, Trump didn't do himself any favors. There were areas where he faltered a little bit, like if you think about the debate when he was asked about white supremacy and some other issues as well. Of course, that doesn't mean that he's a racist, but I think that he just made a few mistakes that hurt him in that regard. But even so, even with that, he was still able to increase his support in the Black community, especially amongst Black men, 18%. So I do think that the media was effective, but the thing about the media is that we can't really focus too much on that because they're always going to do this. I mean, there's never going to be a time where they're going to report fairly on a Republican president. We need to focus on how do we get around that. And I think that Trump can teach us some lessons on that.
Now, we also saw a greater number of Black Republicans running for Congress, like Kim Klacik in Baltimore, actually challenging Democrats in inner city communities in high-profile fashion. But Klacik only wound up with about 28% of the vote. Do you see real movement here, or was this more of a one-off with the GOP concluding that trying to capture urban congressional districts is a futile venture?
Yeah, so I think that these races were significant. I mean, you also had Shannon Wright running for mayor. I've talked to a couple people running in Baltimore. I talked to a guy who was running for city council, Black Republican. And here's the thing, Tim. I mean, the GOP has not been present in these areas in a significant way in decades. So I didn't expect, I hate to say it, but I didn't expect them to win. I expected them to make a showing, and then they did. But I always tell my fellow Republicans, my fellow conservatives, this is not a sprint. It's a marathon. It's going to take a while. And to be honest, the people that I've talked to on the ground in Baltimore, the GOP didn't really get involved until later. Now, better late than never, they started getting involved in supporting these candidates, but it needs to be a full court press supporting candidates in cities like Baltimore, Chicago, Los Angeles, DC. And believe it or not, Black voters are open to hearing from Republicans, but they need to get some of that trust back. I mean, the GOP needs to earn some of that trust back, and I think this is the start of it. So I'm pretty positive about this thing going forward. I don't think that at least not rank and file Republicans will give up on pushing the GOP to court Black voters and Hispanic voters because it's necessary for its survival.
Do you get any indications one way or the other on whether the GOP writ large sees an opening, a real opening in minority communities enough to invest the kind of effort that Trump exerted?
You know, I'm not sure yet. I do think that there is movement in that direction amongst some. I think a lot of Republicans are becoming more open to it. I do think that the establishment is still wanting to go back to business as usual, but I do see an opportunity because there are more and more Republicans that are getting on board with this, and Trump helped with a lot of that. So I think in the future, it is going to be a battle between those who want the status quo and those who actually want the Republican Party to evolve and appeal to more Americans. And in the end, it's going to be the faction that wants more of a bigger tent that is going to win out. Because if it doesn't, then the Republican Party is pretty much gone. If I were to ask every single rank and file Republican voter in this country if they would like to see more Black and Latino voters on our side, 99.9% of them are going to give a resounding yes.
Well, I appreciate you laying that one to rest. And Jeff, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Jeff Charles, socio-political correspondent for LibertyNation.com. When we return, he may not get a second term, but President Trump's dizzying pace of reform over the last 4 years is already certain to leave an indelible impression on the body politic.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, Liberty Nation delivers tomorrow's news.
And remember, Liberty.
Today.
All the time and everywhere.
With LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis.
You're looking at people just rising up.
Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts. And dozens of insightful original articles. And now, you can keep your kids ahead of the curve with LNGenZ.com. LN Gen Z brings a free-thinking education right into your home for students of every grade level with articles, videos, worksheets, and ready-to-go curricula. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. Liberty Nation and LNGenZ.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, he may not get a second term, but President Trump's dizzying pace of reform over these last 4 years is already certain to leave an indelible impression on the body politic. To set the pace for an argument that Donald Trump has forever changed politics, consider just the following. The Republican Party has now become the party of blue-collar America, the working class. Then think of how wildly improbable that really is. The GOP had forever been positioned as the party of the rich, culminating with the ascension of the textbook plutocrat Mitt Romney to the party's presidential nomination in 2012. But when Trump descended that escalator 3 years later, it began a process of transformation in policy and branding, which now represents perhaps the greatest sea change in modern American political history. It ranks at least equal to the Democrats' about-face from the party of segregation to civil rights crusaders during the 1960s. With this transformation or transmutation, represents the most pronounced and profound manifestation of the impact this Trump era has had on the body politic and the indelible imprint it will leave behind, there's been so much more. One by one, the 45th president set out to do exactly what he promised. And why wouldn't he? He was the first truly independent president, already possessed of enormous power and wealth and influence, and thus unbeholden to the money changers. He willingly threw himself to the wolves for a purpose much larger than him, the belief that he was uniquely positioned to achieve systemic reform that he and millions who've become his passionate followers believed no professional politician would be willing or able to even attempt. Indeed, his boldest claim of all was that he and he alone would actually drain the swamp. As Trump proceeded to mold the GOP into a populist America First vessel, Democrats, desperate to take him down by any means available, lurched sharply in the opposite direction, one which formed the starkest possible contrast to the reviled president. And they ultimately outed themselves. Once seen as defenders of the common man, these Democrats spent every waking hour promoting sick and twisted Trump hate fantasies, boxed themselves into an ever tighter corner, and are now branded as the party of coastal elites and the grievance industry. Their unrelenting frontal assault on this president, promoted by their media wing, the ubiquitous sycophants in corporate media, together with election tactics which will leave Trump voters forever in a state of outrage, may lend the feckless Joe Biden in the White House, but their leftward lurch leaves them in a precarious position going forward. And you know what? They know it. No candidate in American history had ever vanquished two dynasties in a single campaign. But Trump made short work of low-energy Jeb Bush and more than a dozen others considered the GOP's best and brightest, and then carved up Hillary Clinton, dealing a blow to the solar plexus of the uniparty political establishment. 5 years after his emergence, the status quo is still coming to grips with the cyclone which descended on D.C. named Donald Trump. The bombastic billionaire laid out a wildly ambitious agenda and pursued it with an impatient spirit and oft-times reckless abandon. All along, he presided over the country as if he would only have 4 years to accomplish his lengthy laundry list of priorities. It seemed that at some level, he sensed that his take-no-prisoners brand of systemic reform would meet with opposition sufficiently fierce to take him down sooner rather than later. and he had no time to waste. And so he came roaring out of the starting gate, intent on accomplishing oft-stated but long-ignored goals of conventional politicians. And he succeeded in a big way on issues of existential significance. A flurry of Mid-East peace treaties after finally moving our embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Genuine energy independence. Repatriation, bringing home profits held overseas, new and improved trade deals, de-escalation of long-running foreign conflicts, accountability for our NATO allies, and a radically different approach to North Korea. He joined those game-changing initiatives with the basic conservative principles of lower taxes and deregulation, sending forth the unmistakable message that America was once again open for business. And he produced a vibrant economy with full employment, which only a pandemic could bring low. It's no secret that many people pulled the lever for Trump in 2016 only because of the Supreme Court. And Trump's judicial work is complete after naming 3 conservative justices and creating a constitutionalist majority on the high court for a generation or more. And with the help of Mitch McConnell, he also pushed through lower court judges at a breakneck pace, filling roughly a third of the federal judiciary. So, why should Trumpists limit their lamentations over the reported outcome of this election? Well, cold comfort that it may be, second terms generally don't end well, especially for presidents on a mission who lay it all on the line from day one. The moment a chief executive is reelected, he becomes a lame duck with dwindling political influence, and the momentum and exhausting pace of the first 4 years subsides slowly but surely. Even in the near-legendary presidency of Ronald Reagan, the second term created more problems than solutions, like Iran-Contra. And in the case of Bill Clinton, impeachment, George W. Bush, a disastrous war, and Barack Obama, a midterm repudiation, the years after re-election only imperiled the legacy of each of those presidents. Trump voters understandably feel wounded and aggrieved at what they almost universally consider a stolen election. 8 years of draining the swamp and a bold America First agenda is what they so desperately wanted. And yet, even if the professional politician from Delaware is sitting in the Oval Office after the fog clears and the dust finally settles from this election, these same people will soon realize that despite getting 4 years instead of 8, Donald Trump's most important work is already done. We'll take a quick break and then come back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
One of the many things that we are desperate for more of these days, it is individual liberty. And thus we introduce once again our segment called Talkin' Liberty as we welcome back in our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, the man we call, fondly, our guardian of individual liberty, Scott Cosenzo. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim. And yes, sadly, the future offers good job security, sad to say, for somebody who needs to point out where liberty may be threatened.
Well, I was stunned by this first story. Chief of Security for the Apple Corporation is charged with bribing a sheriff for gun permits for Apple executives. I thought they were anti-gun, Scott.
You know, it's such a doozy of a story, Tim. It's one of those that's so delicious because I imagine that most people hearing it from my mouth and your mouth will not have heard it elsewhere. This is not a story that's at the top of the crawl on the legacy media outlets. The New York Times isn't going to do an expose flying people in to discover what's happening here. And what's happening is very simple. California has a May issue law for gun permits, which is to say the sheriffs of the counties may issue permits to people they want to give them to issue them to. Curiously enough, that often mostly includes people who generously donate to their campaigns and their friends and their neighbors and family members. Okay, and if you just happen to be a poor guy, or not poor, but regular folk who may have a threat or just want to protect your family, you're denied, and that's what's happened in California. And it's the Santa Clara County Sheriff Lori Smith, and the indictment is against the Apple's security chief, Tim, who offered, according to the indictment, 200 iPads to secure 4 concealed carry permits for Apple executives. By the way, I did the math before we went to Showtime. That's about 140 or 50 grand worth of iPads for 4 permits. That shows you how desperate these people are. We've talked about it before, to arm themselves in the pandemic COVID world, right? And finding it's not so easy as gun grabbers would have you believe.
Gun permits for Apple executives can be summed up with the expression, good for thee, but not for me. Now, one of the subjects we've discussed on and off over the years, Scott, and we've been doing this a long time, this segment for 8 years now, is offensive license plates and whether they constitute free speech. And a court in California, or a court has told the state of California that they, in fact, are free speech.
That's right, Tim. This comes out of a federal court decision that rules that offensive speech is not bannable. Okay, threatening, aggressive, or hostile doesn't include what's bannable. They can go for straight vulgar type speech. They can ban that. But if they're going to allow people to put messages on their license plate for fees, like they do in California, to great income to the state, then they can't exclude messages they think are offensive. And for instance, and I love this example, Tim, one of the plaintiffs in this case wanted a license plate that said queer on it. And a California authority said that was offensive to so many people. And the permit applicant, a gay man who owns Queer Something Records, is the name of his company, said it's not offensive to him. And he would like to have that speech, on his plate. And if he has to live in a world where other people can publish their own private messages on government license plates, why can't he? So a good win for free speech, forced down their throats, sad to say, by the federal courts, but win nonetheless.
Would a pro-Trump license plate be considered merely offensive or downright vulgar? It's a facetious question, Scott.
If you even type something like that into the computer systems, I think they blow up and or report you to some sort of central authority that you do not want to be reported to.
I'm sure you're right. Now, this next one, I honestly had to read this a few times to make sure that I wouldn't start cracking up in laughter or sorrow, I don't know which, at this next one where a lawsuit was settled where U.S. citizens detained in the state of Montana were stopped for speaking Spanish? Really?
Customs and Border Patrol agent Paul O'Neill detained and arrested these women simply because he was in a convenience store checkout line with them and they were casually chatting to one another in Spanish. They were, in Montana, not too far from the Canadian border, where maybe they don't have that many Spanish speakers, which is what he said led him to investigate. And maybe it's appropriate for that man to investigate. And he wants to chat up these women in line with what would be a consensual encounter, like just asking them where they're from or, something like that. That's perfectly reasonable, Tim. But it's not reasonable to place U.S. citizens in custody or detain them because of the language they choose to speak to one another while in line at a convenience store. And the fact that a federal agent sworn to uphold the Constitution doesn't know that is profoundly troubling.
Let's move to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals that has ruled that felons cannot bear arms including if they've committed a white-collar crime involving taxes, for example.
Yeah, this case is a movement Second Amendment case. It's an important case. Well, let me say this. It has the potential to be a very important case. This case is trying to move the needle in Second Amendment jurisprudence to increase the rights that amendment guarantees currently under law. Basically trying to winnow the rules under which those rights can be stripped. And so there was a split in this Third Circuit decision, Tim. There were 2 Democrat appointees and 1 Trump appointee on the 3-judge panel that heard the case. The Trump appointee dissented and mimicked or mirrored the arguments that Amy Coney Barrett had made in a case some years ago, where she questioned whether or not firearms rights could be stripped for crimes that didn't involve any threat or violence, and that the person's ongoing kind of presence in society didn't pose a risk of violence with them being armed. So anyway, I think this is tailor-made for a Supreme Court hearing. The parties have a choice to try to apply for en banc review at the Third Circuit, or they can go right for a request to have the Supreme Court grant the case.
I love when you speak French, Scott. Now, finally, the Illinois Supreme Court has confirmed the existence of illegal traffic ticket, or at least one, illegal traffic ticket quota. Now, that's one of the stereotypes for years. Every time somebody gets stopped, or every time they get a parking ticket, it's, it must be the time of month where they need to fulfill their quota. And I wasn't ever sure if that was actually true, but apparently the Illinois Supreme Court believes it is.
Oh, well, let me just say this, Tim, as a person who's carefully examined these stories over the course of 20 years, the existence of ticket quotas in many departments is absolutely present and unmistakable evidence. But usually courts don't certify that to be the truth, which is why this is a novel story. And it's from the town of Sparta. And they had a point system where an officer had to accumulate so many points in a shift. And they were, for instance, given 1 or 2 points for just a warning ticket and double that for an actual violation ticket. And so there were 2 problems with that. One, the court articulated is, an officer is much more likely to give out a violation if they get, a reward for it, because the punishment was if you didn't accumulate enough points in your shift, you got a talking to with progressive discipline. So it's like, okay, now you're just in trouble, but tomorrow you'll lose a day's pay, or who knows what it might be. So if the cop discovers a greater crime, that's bad evidence.
So any ticket could be considered as compelled by a quota and therefore challengeable, challenging anything else that might be discovered in the course of the stop.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole Politics and Prose, where past is prologue with Mark Angelides, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, and we'll be back at you once again next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty, and we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.